Hey, welcome to the next lecture of the Token Standard course. In this lecture, we will be going into depth about the approval criteria and like kind of how we track amounts, transfers, and so on. So this is kind of the approval criteria interface that we use. This is attached to the um, same interface as you saw in the last lecture as here. Um, so each approval will have the 6 main fields that we talked about in the last lecture, which you can also think of them as approval criteria too, but this is more fine-grained criteria. These are kind of mandatory for all approvals and kind of defines the scope of the approval. Approval criteria will um, these are all optional and can be customized as needed. So this is the interface for the collection approval criteria. For the user level criteria, you might not see all of the fields here, so like you can't override other user level approvals from the user level approval, so you won't see these. And then depending on whether it's incoming or outgoing, you might not be able to restrict, the from address or to address, respectively, because it's hard coded to the actual sender or recipient. But yeah, let's get into it. So this lecture will kind of focus a little more on the approval amounts and like how we track stuff and everything. And then in the next lecture, we'll go into like more just of the generic criteria checks. So let's get started. So the way we do approvals and track the amounts is a little different from normal like ERC20 interfaces where you have an approval, you set a threshold, and then you deduct as necessary. In our case, we introduce the concept of trackers, and over time, trackers are identified by a unique ID, and they're kind of increment only. So any transfer that kind of maps to a specific tracker will increment the amounts or transfers for that tracker. And over time, you just it's increment only, so you just keep adding to it, and you can never kind of reset it. The way to start from scratch and create a new tracker is to just change the tracker ID, which will map to a new tracker. So let's get into approval trackers. So for example, let's look at this scenario. So let's say you're approved for times 10 of IDs 1 to 10, and let's say the tracker ID is XYZ. You might transfer, and the tracker will go increment from times 0, like transfer to times 5, and then maybe you transfer another times 5, and then that'll kind of meet the threshold. And then for all subsequent approvals, you'll fail because you exceeded the threshold. But if subsequent transfers match to the tracker ABC instead of XYZ, the tally will actually start from 0 again because it's a different tracker without any history. Just a kind of roundabout way of saying it's an incrementing tally system, and then you can set thresholds for it. So trackers are made up of a bunch of fields kind of put together, as you can see, like the collection ID, approval level, approval ID, and stuff. So approval level is collection or incoming approvals or outgoing approvals. Approval ID is unique, and one thing I forgot to mention in the last episode is that the approval ID is actually must be unique per level. So you can't have 2 approvals on the same level with the same approval ID. It's a unique identifier. And then you also have other details such as like if we're incrementing on a cumulative or overall basis, if we're incrementing per to address, from address, what the tracker ID is, what the who's approved, and then who's the approver. So in the case of collection approvals, the approver address will be empty, but yeah, so if you put them all together, you might see a ID such as like this. So the tracker corresponding to this ID might look something like this, and then if we change the initiator address to Bob, it will be a new tracker, and we just increment as the other tracker instead. So what do we actually track in these trackers? We track the number of transfers, or the number of times the approval was used, and also the amount transferred per approval. And this is just cumulative, it just adds on every use of the approval. So one important thing to note is that it is done on an as-needed basis. So if we actually don't have any requirements, so like if there's no limit requirements or number transfer requirements, we don't actually increment the trackers because we just save space that way. So note that like if you have a tracker, and then turn it on later, it won't retroactively calculate. We only calculate when there is a requirement there. So trackers are used both for, as I mentioned, approval amounts and approval ID or number of transfers. So in the approval amounts object, you might have a limit of 1,000 or a limit of 10 per initiator, and each one will have its unique ID. And these 1,000 correspond to the ownership and badge IDs of the scope. So this will approve 10 of these badge IDs and these ownership times per initiator, and so on. And then similarly, for the maximum transfers, it's on the same level as the approval amounts. It will just transfer. It'll set the requirements. So this will gate that each initiator can only use this approval one time. 0 means unlimited in our case. So the incrementing tally system is one way to do it, and that's kind of how the typical way is with existing token standards and different existing state-of-the-art stuff. However, we also introduce a new primitive called predetermined balances. So the problem with the tally amount is that there's no control over the amounts. So for example, if you prove 100, you can do 3 transfers of 198, or you can do 100 or any other combination. There's no restriction on what has to occur, what has to occur before the other, and so on. So what we do is we introduce a new primitive called predetermined balances, which will pretty much define the transfers that must take place in a specific order. And if the balances are not exactly as predetermined, the transfer will fail, or the approval will fail. So there is a couple ways you can define the balances. So you can either just manually define them, which is just completely custom, but you have to. It might be a little less scalable because you need to define it for every single potential transfer. You can also use the incremented balances interface, which you can define some start balances and then increment the badge IDs by a certain amount, or ownership times by a certain amount each use. And all of this is the order of transfers is actually determined by a calculation method. So you can either increment on an overall basis. So for example, for the incremented balances, it might go from ×1 to ×2 or badge IDs 1, 2, 3, every single use of the approval by any user. You can also do it per initiator. So each initiator might, if Bob transfers with the use of this approval, he might receive IDs 1, then 2, then 3. But then if Alice transfers, she might also receive 1, 2, and 3. So different ways you can determine the order and how it's reused. You can also use a challenge leaf index. So you can create custom challenges, which we'll actually get into in the next episode. This is kind of how we do the BitBadges claims behind the scenes. And these are just Merkel trees with a commit reveal scheme that you pretty much, if you can prove you know a leaf or a Merkel path to the root that's on chain, you are approved. So in this case, we can use which Merkel path you use can determine what badges you receive or what the order of transfers is. So this can be used for maybe reserving specific increments for certain whitelisted users, or certain increments for specific codes or specific claims. And as I mentioned, this is how we use the BitBadges claims behind the scenes. So you can reserve specific claims off-chain, like claim numbers off-chain for specific badges on-chain. And that's kind of how we bridge that gap. So typically these are the predetermined balances, max number of transfers, and the approval amounts. There are 3 different ways of kind of gating the amounts and transfers and balances. Typically they're not used together. Typically, you'll probably use only one or the other, or maybe max two combined. Although you can use all together, they're kind of conflict a little with each other. So it just depends on how you want to um, approve the transfer and what criteria you need. Most often, you'll probably see predetermined balances used for mints or claims, because you have to have strict requirements for like what the circulating supply will be, who can mint, and so on. But with maybe like post mint transfers, you might consider just like not normal approvals, but tallied approvals.